Hey guys, welcome to Man Medicine, where we talk about how men can optimize their health and escape the collapsing U.S. healthcare system. Well, today I want to talk to you guys a little bit about a little bit more about endocrine disrupting compounds. I know I've touched on this before, but especially as it relates to maybe common things like perfumes and colognes. And the reason I thought of this was I just got back from a really fantastic trip to Dubai, first time I'd ever been there, and that place, it's a remarkable city. So if you ever get a chance to go there, I strongly recommend it. The food was fabulous. It totally blew my diet when I was over there. But had a great time seeing the city. I actually got some training in over there so shout out to Falcons MMA, to you guys for hosting me and letting me come in and do some rolling in your open mats. It's a great group of guys, super friendly. So check them out if you're ever over there. But one of the things that I noticed there, and I think it may just be a cultural thing, is perfumes, colognes, different fragrances were extremely popular. There were shops everywhere that specialized just purely in perfumes and colognes and whatnot. And in fact, like multiple places, like as you go through the markets, would have vendors there, and they were like constantly trying to give you samples. And in fact, one night we were walking along down in the harbor area where there's some pretty good restaurants out there. And, there's guys outside the restaurants kind of hustling, like they got the menus and they're trying to get you to come in and sit down and, come in and dine at the restaurant that night. But I would periodically see these guys and like take a little bit of a break, and they would pull out a bottle of cologne and they would just like douse themselves in this fragrance. And then they would go back out to work and, keep hustling again. And, granted, like this was in the evening, but October, it's still pretty hot there. We missed the obviously the super hot season in the summertime, but we're still looking at like high 80s, or low 90s in the evening time over there. So these poor guys were just sweating up a storm. So I don't know if they were using it like as a deodorant or whatnot, but they were dousing themselves in what they thought was cologne, but actually was a toxic soup of endocrine disrupting compounds. And so that's what I want to talk about a little bit today, so you guys don't make the same mistake. And I hope that maybe at the end of this talk, you'll be a little wiser, and maybe we'll go up into your bathrooms if you have any of that stuff and chuck it all out, because nothing good is going to happen if you continue to use it and continue to expose yourself to it, as I'm going to show you here in this brief little talk. So what are endocrine disrupting compounds? So the Endocrine Society defines these as, quote, an exogenous chemical or mixture of chemicals that can interfere with any aspect of hormone action. So pretty broad definition. So we're going to focus mainly on the androgen receptor and the effects with androgens and estrogens in men. Just going to touch on that a little bit, but really, like, it could affect thyroid function, it could affect insulin, could affect any part of the endocrine system. And there are absolutely there's too many of these to count. Thousands and thousands of industrial chemicals that have been identified as endocrine disrupting compounds, most of which are still freely used and are not restricted, at least in the United States. There's a number of other countries that have, much tighter regulations, like throughout the EU, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But they're everywhere, and and quite frankly, there are probably thousands and thousands more that have endocrine disrupting properties that we just haven't identified yet because nobody's done the study. So, in my opinion, and the opinion of the Endocrine Society, this is a huge public health issue. And I think it's vastly underappreciated, vastly underrecognized. And I think it has a huge role to play in the declining sperm counts and the declining testosterone levels that we're seeing in men, not to mention the obesity crisis. There's really good data that shows that endocrine disrupting compounds, chronic exposure, even exposure in utero, is predisposing people towards obesity, adiposity, what have you, and a whole host of obviously chronic diseases that result from that. So not just diabetes, but cancer, heart disease, etc. So major problem. And it's what makes it worse is that it's virtually impossible to completely isolate yourself from this stuff. It is absolutely everywhere. But there are a few steps that you can take, and we'll talk about them at the end of the talk, that you can hopefully minimize your exposure to this. But the point of this little talk is, and the point I want to drive home to you guys is that, fragrances, the vast majority of fragrances, and we're also, I'm lumping in like personal hygiene products, soaps, shampoos, many toothpastes, many of them are loaded with this stuff. And, these are common everyday products. We all use them every single day without thinking at all about it, but we're literally bathing in this stuff. And, there are potential health ramifications to that. So let's dive into that a little bit. So as early as 2012, the WHO, they warned that endocrine disrupting compounds they called it a global threat, which is a pretty big statement from the WHO. 8 years later, the European Commission said that the use of EDCs is on the rise, and they pose a serious risk to human health, and they create an economic cost to society. So that's important, right? For all this chronic disease that's resulting from exposure to these chemicals, there's an economic cost to that because it spills over into the healthcare system. And we're finding out more and more that these EDCs are linked to all sorts of childhood, developmental issues, brain development, brain growth, growth of the actual skeleton. They've been linked to reproductive and fertility problems. I mentioned the sperm counts, but also like hormone sensitive cancers, both prostate and breast cancer have been strongly linked to exposure to, various endocrine disrupting compounds. So this is kind of a big deal. And it's not anything to take lightly, but it's interesting to me that hardly anybody's talking about this, and it's a huge problem. So I mentioned that other countries outside of the United States have started to wake up to this, and the EU as a whole is doing a heck of a lot better than the United States and Canada. Although I think Canada is a little bit ahead of the United States in recognizing that this is a major problem. So they have banned, hundreds and hundreds of these chemicals from consumer products. But of course, they're freely available still in the United States. So according to the Environmental Working Group, they say the European Union has banned or restricted more than 1,000 ingredients from use in personal care products. And get this, compared with only 11 chemicals restricted or prohibited by the US FDA. Okay, wow. So they've banned over 1,000 of these and consider them dangerous, too dangerous to be allowed to put into consumer products. But in the United States, we've got 11. So you got to wonder, why is that? Why, what could be driving that phenomenon, And a lot of it has to do with the efforts of gentlemen like this. So this is Ross Eisenberg. He is the president of America's Plastic Makers and the American Chemistry Council. And so in his bio, it says that, and he's proud of this. This is not something that I would want to be described as, but he said he's recognized as one of the Hill's top lobbyists. And then the Washingtonian named him as one of the 500 most influential people in Washington. Okay, so this guy's a mover and a shaker. This guy has the ear of politicians, and the whole purpose of the America's Plastic Makers and the American Chemistry Council is not to promote chemistry and to get kids in school to learn about Avogadro's number and to foster love of chemistry. Okay, it's to advance the interests of the plastics and the chemical industry, right? To keep those guys in business, to keep the cash flowing. So, it's pretty well recognized that phthalates are bad. Phthalates are toxic. I'm going to talk briefly about those, but they are recognized endocrine disrupting compounds. The amount of data out there that shows that these have harmful effects, not just on reproduction, but on childhood development, and also in a host of different cancers. The evidence for that is incontrovertible, but not according to the American Chemistry Council. They say, quote, some of these concerns from environmental groups are based on high dose animal testing. The exposure that we really see in people, and we have the CDC numbers to back that up, is remarkably low. To us, why bother getting rid of a highly useful product when there should be no concern? End quote. So that particular quote, I don't think that's going to age well as time goes on. But they are on record as saying, don't worry about this. The amount of stuff that you're exposed to on a day-to-day basis, it's minuscule. Don't worry about it. Well, this kind of reminds me of like some of the scientists and doctors that were paid off like by the tobacco industry in the 50s to say that smoking is not bad for you. Smoking doesn't cause lung cancer and nicotine's not addictive. That didn't age well either. And I think that's what's going to happen with this quote. But, regardless, they say we have the CDC numbers to back that up. And what they mean by that is, so individual exposure to individual endocrine disrupting compounds, just in and of themselves in the average person is relatively low. But the problem is that we're exposed to hundreds and maybe thousands of these simultaneously, right? So they have a cumulative effect as shown on this diagram here. It says something from nothing. Mixture toxicity matters. So on the bar graph here, it shows that there's a minimum effect level, and then it shows a bunch of different endocrine disrupting compounds, individual ones down at the bottom. And so for if you look at these as individuals, none of them reach that minimum effect level where you can have documented toxicity. But the thing is, you're not just exposed to one or two, you're exposed to all five of these. And it's the cumulative effect that pushes above that minimum effect level, that toxic threshold. So now you're starting to see problems. So, Mr. Eisenberg and his colleagues are not exactly being, completely honest, when they say that there should be no concern. So anyway, there is no, there's no like EU version of the American Chemistry Council that is pushing that agenda over there. And in my opinion, that it has a lot to do with why they have vastly different laws over there that actually protect the public, whereas we in the United States do not. So you feel free to, differ with me, or if you have alternative explanations, I'd love to hear it. But, the lobbying of the American Chemistry Council probably has a lot to do with the current state of affairs. So, okay, let's talk about perfumes a little bit. So this is a report that was put out by 3 different consumer protection groups in Denmark that I cannot pronounce. and the title is called "What's That Smell?" And so what they did is they looked at a whole bunch of like very popular women's perfumes from Chanel, Ralph Lauren, Dior, Armani, Yves Saint Laurent. I've never heard of these, but I'm sure if there's any ladies listening, you probably know what I'm talking about. And so they were able to get the ingredients list from the manufacturers, and they went through each ingredient. And they looked at 22 of these perfumes, and they found that 20 of them had problematic substances, and problematic in terms of endocrine disrupting capabilities, or like potent allergens, or other compounds that pose like other potential serious health problems. And this was in Denmark, right? So this is in the EU, where already they're not allowed to put some of the more heinous and egregious ingredients in there, like BPA, phthalates, etc. So, which are allowed in the United States to some extent. So this is a list here of substances of concern found in these 20 brand name perfumes. And these were big name brands, apparently. And you can see the list here if you're interested in it. A large number of these were considered to be potent allergens. And then you can see a large number of them as well were considered to be suspected endocrine disrupting compounds. All right, so it's a big problem. It's a big problem. So let's talk about BPA or bisphenol A. There are lots of other bisphenols besides A. This is a particularly noxious chemical, and it is found absolutely everywhere. It's a synthetic polymer, so it's in all sorts of like polycarbonate plastics, epoxy resins. It is found in the urine. There are detectable levels of BPA in the urine of 93% of Americans. okay, that have been screened. So, and it's not just in the urine; it's in the blood, it's in breast milk, it's in spinal fluid. So there are significant levels of this stuff in just about all of us. It just shows you how hard it is to avoid it. It's absolutely everywhere. And the interesting thing about this is that it binds to the estrogen receptor, so it has weak estrogenic activity, but it also binds to the androgen receptor and blocks the androgen receptor. So it's pro-estrogenic, anti-androgenic. And you can imagine that, if you're a developing fetus, that could be a serious problem. Or if you're a teenager who's going through puberty, right, that could be a problem. So this has been linked to, the genital deformities in animals and in, both in the wild and in lab studies. It's been linked to reduced sperm counts in men. It's been reduced or linked to erectile dysfunction, whole host of like neurocognitive issues. So this stuff is particularly bad, and it's absolutely everywhere. Phthalates, are also, on the radar. There's one in particular called butylbenzene phthalate, or BBP, which is also widespread. Now, this is the one phthalates are in very high concentrations in personal care products. So these colognes and perfumes that we're talking about. The sample that I saw was saying that 77% of colognes and perfumes in the United States have significant levels of phthalates. So every time you guys, when you go out for a date and you put on your aftershave and your cologne, yeah, well, guess what? You're blocking your androgen receptor. You're making yourself potentially less masculine. So so it's not just in personal care products, though. It's in in solvents, plastics, varnish. So like nail polish. So women that get their nails done, they're basically just painting on phthalate containing, chemicals, and then, some of that obviously is going to get systemically absorbed. Like the blister pill packs that you get medication in, so high concentrations of phthalates, IV tubing, like that I use at the hospital. I mean, that stuff is, the lining of that stuff, as the saline goes through, it's picking up some phthalates and, basically putting it right into your bloodstream. So I bet you didn't know that. I didn't know that until not that long ago. So that doesn't make me feel good. Every time I order an IV, I'm increasing somebody's exposure to one or more different phthalates. And this does, there is real world implications with this in terms of fertility. There was a study at a Massachusetts infertility clinic that I don't have the reference to, but basically they showed that, there was a direct correlation with, the men with the lowest sperm counts also had the highest level of various metabolites of this BBP stuff. So, it may not have been causal, they may have other issues, but there seemed to be a direct linear relationship between the amount of this stuff in your system and also having a low sperm count and, having enough problem conceiving that you had to present to a fertility clinic. So major problem. And if all that wasn't bad enough, this to me, this paper, I didn't actually know this before I did some research for this talk. This is actually kind of terrifying. So this is an article from the June 2019 issue of Endocrinology. Transgenerational effects of endocrine disrupting chemicals on male and female reproduction. So transgenerational, let me show you what that means. So here's a little diagram of these mice that they exposed to various endocrine disrupting chemicals. So here at F0, they exposed pregnant mice to a number of different endocrine disrupting compounds, and so the fetal mice were affected. Okay, so F1, that first generation, they suffered the effects of that. So they had anogenital malformations, they had a bunch of other cancers and things like that. And not surprisingly, their offspring also had problems, because if you think about it, in mammals, the eggs, like in a woman's eggs that are in her ovary, are formed in utero. So that whatever the fetus is exposed to, those developing ova are exposed to as well. So it's not surprising that the following generation would also have some issues. And that's exactly what they found here. F2, with this next generation of mice, also suffered some adverse effects from these endocrine disrupting compounds. Now, here's what's really concerning is this F3 generation that you see there. So these mice were never exposed to any of this stuff, yet they also still suffered deleterious effects from exposure to endocrine disrupting compounds 3 generations before that, through what they speculated as a number of like epigenetic mechanisms. So guys, this stuff that you're being exposed to now has potential to and like that your wife is potentially being exposed to if she's pregnant. This could be pushed forward 2, 3, maybe even more generations from now. So it's really, really important that you get a handle on this and try to limit your exposure, because it's not just about you, it's going to be about subsequent generations in your family as well. And I can imagine that this whole process, unless we in the West start cleaning up our act a little bit, is going to get potentially a lot worse. Okay, just to kind of round out, some of the deleterious effects of this stuff. This is a pretty good paper here from Environmental Research, 2017, Neurotoxicity of Fragrance Compounds, a review. So this is a really good article if you want to look it up. If you want to read about all the potential developmental neurotoxicities and problems with brain development that happen in children that are exposed to this stuff, but not just children, but also there are serious psychiatric and mental issues and other cognitive problems in adults as well. So in terms of the kids, I'm just going to give you just a brief summary. What they said was in children aged 4 to 9, prenatal exposure, so they measured the amount of endocrine disrupting compounds, various ones, mostly phthalates, and the urine samples of their mothers during the 3rd trimester. And then they followed these kids and they tested them and kind of saw what happened to them. So by age 4 to 9, what they saw was a significantly worsening in terms of behavioral and executive functioning. So what they're saying is IQ, okay, including attention, problem solving, externalization, emotional control. So these kids were like totally out of control. They could not self-regulate as well as kids that had lower level exposures. Aggression and depression, and then older children, through the teenage years had markedly elevated levels of ADHD symptoms, essentially, in addition to other behavioral issues as well. So these kids did not do well, and this is from in utero exposure and presumably ongoing exposure as they were growing up and going through their life. So what I already know that some of you out there are thinking, well, there's got to be natural fragrances out there that I can use. Everybody seems to love essential oils. Couldn't be bad for you, right? Like essential oils they're all natural. They're essential, right? Well, not so fast. So this particular study caused a lot of controversy when it came out in 2007 in the New England Journal of Medicine, and it was a series of case reports of unexplained gynecomastia in young children, pre-pubertal children, who were heavily exposed to either lavender oil or tea tree oil by their parents, usually on a daily basis, almost since birth. And they all developed gynecomastia that resolved when the exposure stopped. So they talk about some studies in here that highlighted the anti-androgen or anti-androgenic properties of those 2 oils, lavender and tea tree oil. Now, certainly other essential oils could have similar properties. Some of them may not. I'm not an expert on essential oils, but this particular study I thought was super, super interesting. So they assessed the response of a special strain of breast cancer cells. So they put them in a petri dish and they inserted a plasmid that created a protein whenever DHT was bound to the androgen receptor that was on that cell. Okay, I hope that makes sense. And so this is the chart here. So this dark blue or green bar here, so average fold increase above control. This was the amount of, I think it was called luciferase, was the enzyme that was induced. So they would put the cells in a dish. they would give them a certain concentration of DHT, dihydrotestosterone, and then they would measure the amount of this luciferase enzyme that was produced. And in the control group, there was a lot. So it was over a fourfold increase in the production of this enzyme. The DHT would come in, it would bind to the androgen receptor, and it would stimulate the results or stimulate this luciferase enzyme to be produced. And then you could actually measure that. So it's actually a pretty straightforward study. And then they put in something called, as a control, they put in flutamide, which is an anti-androgen that, you know, I think used to get used in the urology world to treat hormone-sensitive prostate cancers. I don't think it gets used that much anymore, but it like completely blocks the androgen receptor. So as you can see there, that bar is way low. So that blocked the DHT, so there's not going to be much of this luciferase enzyme produced. And then they said, okay, well, let's put in some lavender oil, and then we'll do another dish that has tea tree. Now, what's really interesting is when they expose these cells to both lavender oil and tea tree oil in separate dishes, they have very similar effects, as you can see, to the flutamide. So they block the androgen receptor as well. So at least based on this preliminary data, I know there's actually still some controversy about this, but these two essential oils do seem to have endocrine disrupting effects at the level of the androgen receptor. So again, I would avoid them. Tea tree oil and lavender oil get used in all sorts of products, all sorts of fragrances and colognes and like personal hygiene products. People love to rub tea tree oil on their joints and stuff like that. I personally would stay away from this stuff. It seems like there's definitely something going on there, and it's probably not worth it. So these are a couple websites if you're interested. Chemtrust.org has some good information on endocrine disrupting compounds. If you go to the Endocrine Society website, they also have some good material as well. And then this is the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. This is their website here up on the screen, and you can check that out as well. And I'll put links in the description too, if you guys want to learn a little bit more about this. So, you know, we'll wrap things up here. Like, what can you do about this? Well, you know, again, the bottom line, as I said earlier, is like it's very difficult to completely eliminate this stuff. You will be exposed to it just by living in the modern world. And I don't think there's a place on the planet you can go to where you'll have zero endocrine disrupting compound exposure. But avoiding plastic bottles, plastic food wraps. You don't want to heat food in the microwave that's still in its plastic container. Canned foods are known to have a lot of phthalates. Anything that's packaged with a recycling label like number 3 or number 7, those are particularly toxic. So remember those, number 3 and number 7. They have a little recycling symbol with the number in between them. Non-stick pans are to be avoided. You know, any of the black plastic cookware like spatulas and spoons, you know, that stuff is made from recycled plastics that contain endocrine disrupting compounds. And obviously, if you expose it to heat, like with a frying pan and stuff, you know, you can potentially expose yourself that way. I've gotten rid of all my plastic cups and glasses. I only drink out of either glass, or like a metal lined, you know, thermos or a big growler. So I've got my water here in this metal lined cup, and that's what I take with me, and that's what I drink, you know, while I'm here at the office working. So do the best you can. It's very hard to avoid, but just, you know, keep in mind, like a lot of the products that you guys probably use on a regular basis are loaded with this stuff. And, you know, eliminating perfumes and colognes and fragrances, you know, as a guy, that should be something that's relatively easy to do. I know women, you know, they tend to like that stuff a lot, but you don't need cologne, okay? You don't need to rub yourself in essential oils to smell nice. You know, try to minimize. You know, if you got a hot date, you want to do it every now and then, I guess that's probably fine. But just keep in mind that stuff is not good for you, and it likely is harming you. You know, to what extent, I can't say, but it's certainly not helping things. So anyway, that's all I have for you guys today. Certainly if you have some comments, please leave them. This is a tough one because, like I said, it's very difficult to completely avoid exposure to this stuff, but do the best you can. It's not only important for you, it's important for your kids, and it may be important for your grandkids and maybe even your great grandkids, at least based on that prior study. So, all right, guys, take care. I will talk to you next time. Bye.
All Man Medicine video and audio has been created and shared online for informational purposes only. This podcast does not constitute the practice of medicine or professional healthcare services of any kind, including the giving of medical advice. I am not your doctor. No doctor-patient relationship has been established. This content is not meant to be a substitute for professional medical advice and should not be relied upon solely for that purpose either. The only purpose of this content is to present peer-reviewed, research-backed health information for your consideration. As always, rely on the advice and guidance of your personal physician before undertaking any activity presented here, and if in doubt or not comfortable with said activity, practice discretion. Your health is your responsibility and not ours. Finally, I take conflicts of interest seriously. I accept no compensation whatsoever from any private corporations, including pharmaceutical or supplement companies. You can trust that if I recommend a medication, product, or service, it's because I genuinely believe in it and not because I'm being paid to endorse it.